Oh,
So
thank you so much. And I suppose now that the really hard task of offering a sort of, well, not a hard task to offer final thanks, but to offer something of a distillation of the very rich and varied discussions that we've had over the day. I think it's really interesting. We started this morning sort of reflecting on in my sort of opening remarks, sort of Hannah Arendt's work and that idea of political practice being inherently theatrical. So quite nice in a way to come full circle in that final panel on performativity and hear about 19th century makeup and how that could in some ways be analogous to the Pierrot and the costume of that character and how it would be a disaster if that were the case. But also, of course, in Sean's discussion there, that idea of the clown. So I think there's a nice flow and as I said, sort of circular nature to this discussion in some ways, which I think is it has been quite nice. But when we were putting this symposium together, and I was having discussions with Elizabeth along with other colleagues, we were thinking about sort of some of the themes in terms of putting together the call for papers. What did we think would be some of the sort of key angles? And I think what's interesting through the discussion that we've had today is as varied as it has been, is the one, I suppose, concept or one theme that for me we've continued to come back to is that of gender. It was, I think, really that topic that sort of lit the chat up. And again, in this final discussion, particularly Sean's remarks about agency and the agency of women, but again, striking parallels to or accord with many of the talks that we've heard today, and again where we started with Teresa's wonderful keynote and reflecting on the role of men in the sort of insurrection in Washington, D.C. and those scenes that we saw. So I think for me, that's been quite interesting, just the centrality of that theme of gender. And also, I suppose, as we've been talking, wearing our sort of different sort of professional hats and bringing to bear our different experiences, of course, it struck me, and it's not a particularly revelatory point, but something that, you know, I think only through these discussions have I really been able to reflect on it in depth, is that as much as we are all sort of analysts, we're all here as sort of practitioners, academics, curators, etc. One thing, of course, that does make this discussion, I think, so poignant and so timely is as much as we're thinking about masks, as much as we're thinking about headwear, we're of course in this very unique situation, and unique is probably putting it mildly, where of course we are also all wearing masks. So that direct engagement with what we are writing about or incorporating into our practice, which is probably something that's quite new for all of us. And it got me thinking that as we were talking through the various panels about maybe what others are doing in the present or in the past, what decisions did we make when we were confronted with the task that we had to mask up in our daily lives? I wonder what sort of dialogues you had with yourselves or your immediate family in response to Fiona's talk and Katie's talk earlier this morning. Lots of discussions in the chat about making our masks and making our masks for our family members. So what, I wonder, sort of thoughts were going through your mind. Again, we've heard a lot of talk about men and men not wanting to mask up. But my own reflection actually is that when we had to mask, I it was on, I can't remember what the website was. It wasn't Etsy, but something similar. I bought a sort of baby pink mask and had it monogrammed. I mean, that was my first sort of thought. But again, reflecting on the points that sort of Andrew and Daniela made, you know, me kind of thinking about this as a fashion opportunity, was that wrong? Was that somehow sort of shameful? But I mean, in my personal view, not masking up as a man wasn't necessarily something that occurred to me. So again, I just think as we're reflecting as academics, as curators, practitioners, etc., interesting to sort of think about our own personal roles and relationships with some of the sort of issues, peoples, cultures that we are talking about. And I think also where we started this morning with a series of kind of dualities, the idea of masks being, in one sense, quite innocuous items, but also deeply important at the same time, the practical, the philosophical. I mentioned also the physical and metaphysical. And again, how that sense of the duality has kind of continued in terms of what we're hearing in that final panel about presence, sort of visibility or invisibility. Again, coming back to what Sean was making. And again, another sort of conundrum where we all are. The mask is a physical thing, and I think thingness, if you like, becomes really important, particularly when we're dealing with a threat, a virus that, of course, is invisible. And so how do we express our agency in dealing with this invisible thing, or this invisible idea, I suppose, that, using physical things to do that, again, I thought was quite interesting. And as a historian, inevitably, I think the continuities, I thought it was particularly interesting in Alison and Miriam's talk, when we were thinking about mask wearing. Were people wearing masks, in a sense, engaged in nefarious activities and criminality, or were they responsible citizens? And that sort of blurring, again, hearing recently in newspaper reports in this country and for Europe, that the pandemic and mask wearing nonetheless did facilitate opportunities for crime. Or as we were hearing earlier, again, in terms of thinking about parallels with Caroline's talk, similar responses perhaps between the pandemic in the present, but also that of 1918 to 1919. And how we respond to these crises. Sort of three words that I jotted down, and again, sort of demonstrating my love of alliteration, but one was catalyst. How the pandemic now, but also possibly in 1918, 1919, was a catalyst for change. We're hearing that particularly in the first panel with the remarks from David and Doris and Sarah, using technology or grappling with issues of sustainability and inclusivity, which the fashion industry largely has struggled with. Another word, though, and I think, again, this idea of dualities, namely crystallize, that as much as the pandemic and that we're experiencing now and our use and conception of masks can force us to change, so too can it enforce a sense of rigidity and sticking to values and traditions that we don't want to change. And maybe we've seen that most stubbornly and terrifyingly, perhaps, in the protests in Washington, D.C., sticking to political ideas rather than seeing this as a moment for change. But as I said, and coming back to those talks from Alison and Caroline, also continuities. So I hope we can kind of knit, I sort of offer those as just sort of some of my thoughts. And I know I need sort of time to kind of let some of them sort of percolate, but I hope they can be sort of points to ponder before we regroup again tomorrow. As I've been talking, I've sort of seen that the chat is...
yeah, there's some interesting chat going on there. Discussing, cosplayers commonly discuss, says Teresa, how the mask or costume allows them to overcome social anxieties. Which, again, that question of agency comes up there. This last discussion that we had made me think of Blue Jeans by Daniel Miller and Sophie Woodward, and actually the power of the ordinary, and this idea that in my research, what I found is how men become convinced to wear the mask if there's a mandate, where it's then not a symbol of shame or what Goffman might say stigma, a weakness of illness, which I'll talk more about this tomorrow. But I think there is something there about that we're kind of allowed to look at maybe now with the mask being something that we're all wearing, reflecting on how that feels and which mask, where do we wear it, when do we wear it, this idea of hiding or being ordinary rather than standing out. that I think is really interesting. And that idea of maybe there's some agency in just being ordinary too, as well as being in costume.
No, I think that's true. Particularly the way that there has been such upheavals. Maybe there is that sort of courage in the ordinariness in a way. But as you say, that is going to sort of anticipate some of the themes that you're going to be conjuring with in your talk tomorrow. So, as I said, with thoughts of tomorrow, maybe that's a nice place